The federal death penalty in the United States is one of the most severe forms of justice, but it is also one of the most controversial. Although it is applied in all 50 states and territories, its use is exceptional. In fact, President Biden commuted the federal death sentences of 37 men on December 23, 2024, leaving only 3 prisoners on federal death row. However, this was not always the norm. During the Trump administration, federal capital punishment was revived after a nearly 2-decade hiatus. In his first term, Trump oversaw the execution of 13 convicts, becoming the president with the most executions in over a century. Now, in his new term, history may repeat itself. Will we witness new executions under his administration? In this video, we explore the crimes committed by these convicts, the last meal they requested, their final words, and how they were executed. Welcome to Criminal Records. Daniel Lewis Lee, State, Indiana. On January 11, 1996, Daniel Lewis Lee, along with his accomplice Chevy Kehoe, broke into the home of William Frederick Mueller, a firearms dealer in Arkansas. Their intention was to steal firearms and cash. Inside the house were Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. Lee and Kehoe subdued the family, took them to the basement, placed plastic bags over their heads, and bound them with duct tape. They then threw their bodies into a swamp in northeastern Arkansas, where they were found months later. Lee was arrested in June 1997 and, after a trial in 1999, was sentenced to death in federal court on multiple charges, including murder during a robbery and conspiracy. Despite his defense's attempts to reduce his sentence by arguing that Kehoe, the alleged leader of the crime, received a life sentence, the court upheld the death penalty. He spent over 20 years on death row while various legal battles over his execution were fought. The day before his execution, he was offered a last meal. However, Lee rejected the special meal and chose to have the standard prison menu. On July 14, 2020, Daniel Lewis Lee was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The execution had been scheduled for the previous day but was delayed by last-minute appeals. Finally, after the Supreme Court lifted the stay, the procedure was carried out in the early hours. When asked for his last words, Lee said, "I didn't do it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a killer. You're killing an innocent man." He then closed his eyes and remained silent while the lethal injection was administered. He was declared dead at 8:07 a.m. Wesley Ira Perkey, State, Indiana. On January 26, 1998, in Kansas City, Missouri, Wesley Ira Perkey abducted 16-year-old Jennifer Long. After ending her life, he dismembered her body and disposed of it in a septic pond in Kansas. He was also convicted of ending the life of an 80-year-old woman with a hammer. Perkey was arrested and found guilty in federal court in 2003. He was sentenced to death and spent 17 years on death row at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. During his time in prison, his lawyers argued that he suffered from schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, attempting to halt his execution without success. The day before his execution, he was offered a last meal. Perkey requested a nut cake. On July 16, 2020, Wesley Ira Perkey was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The execution was carried out after a long legal battle over his mental state. When asked for his last words, Perkey said, "I deeply regret the pain I caused to Jennifer Long's family. I am so sorry." He then closed his eyes and remained silent until he was declared dead at 8:19 a.m. Dustin Honkin, State, Indiana. On July 25, 1993, Dustin Honkin, a methamphetamine dealer, along with his girlfriend Angela Johnson, kidnapped and ended the lives of 5 people in Mason City, Iowa. Among the victims were Greg Nicholson, a former associate who had become a police informant, Lori Duncan, Nicholson's girlfriend who had no ties to drug trafficking, and Lori's two daughters, Candy and Amber, aged 10 and 6 respectively. Additionally, Honken also ended the life of Terry DeGius, another drug dealer, by beating him with a bat and shooting him. The murders occurred while Honken was out on bail for a drug case. Nicholson and Lori Duncan were tied up, gagged, and shot multiple times, while Candy and Amber, dressed in swimsuits on a hot summer day, were executed with gunshots to the head. Their bodies were not found until 7 years later. In 2005, Honken was found guilty and sentenced to death on 5 counts of murder. He then spent time on death row at the United States Penitentiary Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana. The day before his execution, he was offered a last meal, but there are no official records of what Honken requested. On July 17, 2020, Honken was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute. His execution marked the resumption of the federal death penalty after 17 years of inactivity. When asked for his last words, Honken responded, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me. Lesmond Charles Mitchell. State, Arizona." On October 28, 2001, Lesmond Charles Mitchell and Johnny Theodore Orsinger were hitchhiking when they were picked up by 63-year-old Alice Slim and her 9-year-old granddaughter Tiffany Lee. Slim and Lee were returning home after visiting friends in Gallup, New Mexico. During the trip, Mitchell and Orsinger attacked the victims. Mitchell slit the young girl's throat, while Orsinger struck Slim with rocks and stabbed her to death. They then dragged the bodies to a nearby forest, decapitated them, set them on fire, and buried them in a shallow grave. Afterwards, they used Slim's vehicle to commit an armed robbery at a post office. Authorities conducted an extensive investigation, leading to the arrest of Mitchell and several of his accomplices on November 4th and 5th, 2001. A federal grand jury indicted Mitchell on 11 charges, including kidnapping, vehicle theft, and murder. Since the crimes occurred during a carjacking, the case was handled at the federal level. During his trial in April 2003, Mitchell's defense argued that while he was present, he was not the primary perpetrator of the murders. However, on May 8th, he was found guilty and sentenced to death on September the 15th of the same year. On August 26, 2020, Lesmond Charles Mitchell was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute, Indiana. Family members of the victims and members of the Navajo Nation, who opposed the execution, were present in the witness room. When asked for his last words, Mitchell responded, "No, I'm fine." He was declared dead at 6:29 p.m. Keith Dwayne Nelson, State, Missouri. On October 12, 1999, Pamela Irene Butler, a 10-year-old girl, disappeared while skating in front of her home in Kansas City, Kansas. Keith Dwayne Nelson, 24 years old, abducted her in front of her older sister, who screamed upon witnessing the abduction. Several witnesses saw the incident and noted the license plate of the white van in which she was taken. Nelson drove to a forest in Grain Valley, Missouri, where he abused and strangled Pamela with a wire. He then abandoned her body in a wooded area near a church. A janitor from the church noticed the suspicious van and, along with his wife, reported it to the police after seeing the news about the kidnapping. The next day, the van was found abandoned in Kansas City, Missouri. 2 days after the crime, a civilian employee of the police department discovered Nelson hiding under a bridge. He tried to escape by swimming across a river, but he was surrounded by railroad workers until the police arrived. When asked where Pamela was, Nelson replied that he knew but would not say. The next day, the police found the girl's body in the wooded area behind the Grain Valley Christian Church. On October 21, 1999, Nelson was federally charged with kidnapping resulting in death. Since he crossed state lines with the victim, his case fell under the jurisdiction of the Federal Kidnapping Act. In November 2001, Nelson pled guilty, and a jury sentenced him to death. The defense argued his traumatic childhood and psychological issues, but the prosecution emphasized the brutality of the crime and his lack of remorse. On August 28, 2020, Keith Dwayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary, Indiana. His last words were, "No." He was declared dead at 4:32 p.m. William Emmett LaCroix, Jr., State, Georgia. On October 7, 2001, Joanne Lee Tiesler, a 30-year-old nurse, was attacked in her home in Cherry Log, Georgia. William Emmett LaCroix Jr., a former soldier and sex offender, broke into her house while she was away, waited for her to return, and then tied her up with wires, assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly. He then fled in his vehicle, a 1996 black Ford Explorer. The police quickly identified LaCroix as the prime suspect since he lived near the victim and had been seen spying on her with binoculars. He had an extensive criminal record that included theft and child abuse. He had been released from federal prison just a month before the crime. On October 11, 2001, Border Patrol agents detained LaCroix in Minnesota as he attempted to cross into Canada with the stolen vehicle. During his arrest, he confessed in detail to the crime and claimed he had mistaken Tiesler for someone from his past. In 2004, LaCroix was convicted in federal court for carjacking resulting in death, a crime that carries the death penalty. His defense argued that the murder was not premeditated and that he should not be tried at the federal level. However, the prosecution proved that he had planned the crime, including purchasing the cables with which he bound her. He was sentenced to death on March 10, 2004. One day before being executed, he was offered a last meal. Initially, he requested KFC chicken, but his request was denied due to security concerns over the bones. He then asked for Pizza Hut, which was approved. On September 22, 2020, William LaCroix was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution was the sixth carried out by the federal government that year. His defense requested clemency, citing the death of his brother Chad LaCroix, a state trooper killed in 2010, as a reason not to further distress his family. However, President Donald Trump rejected the request and allowed the execution to proceed. When asked for his last words, LaCroix simply closed his eyes and said nothing. He was declared dead at 9:06 p.m., Christopher Villalva State, Indiana. On June 21, 1999, in Fort Hood, Texas, 19-year-old Christopher Villalva, along with 4 accomplices, ended the lives of Todd and Stacy Bagley, a couple from Iowa. The group approached them at a gas station with the intent to rob them and asked for a ride. Once inside the vehicle, Villalva pulled out a gun and forced the couple into the trunk, where they remained for hours while their captors withdrew money from their card and stole their belongings. Later, in a remote area, Villalva ordered that the inside of the car be sprayed with flammable liquid. While the Bagleys sang, "Jesus loves me," and begged for their lives, Villalva shot them in the head. Stacy was still alive when his accomplice, Brandon Bernard, set the car on fire. Villalva and Bernard were arrested days later and sentenced to death in 2000 under federal jurisdiction, as the crime occurred on military land. 3 other involved individuals, who were minors, received prison sentences. One day before being executed, he was offered a last meal. Villalva requested a pepperoni pizza from Pizza Hut and a soda. On September 24, 2020, Christopher Villalva was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. When asked for his last words, he said, I am more than the worst thing I've done. Change is possible if people want it. I'm ready, Father." He was declared dead at 6:42 p.m., Orlando Hall, State, Arkansas. In the mid-1990s, Orlando Hall, Bruce Webster, and Marvin Holloway operated a drug trafficking ring in Arkansas, aided by Stephen Beckley, who transported marijuana from Texas. On September 21, 1994, Orlando traveled to Texas for a drug deal with Neil Renee and Stanfield Vitalis, who swindled him out of $4,700. Enraged, Orlando tracked down the scammers and, 3 days later, broke into their apartment with Webster, Demetrius Hall, and Beckley. They didn't find the men, but instead kidnapped their 16-year-old sister, Lisa Renee. During the trip to Arkansas, they repeatedly abused her. To prevent her from reporting them, they hit her with a shovel, buried her alive, and suffocated her in a park. 3 days later, Orlando, Demetrius, and Beckley were arrested, and Orlando confessed to his involvement in the crime. The case became federal due to the crossing of state borders. Orlando Hall and Bruce Webster were charged with kidnapping resulting in death, among other charges, and both faced the death penalty. In 1995, Orlando was found guilty and sentenced to death. Webster was also sentenced to death, but his sentence was overturned in 2019 due to intellectual disability. On November 19, 2020, Orlando Hall was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. Before his execution, he converted to Islam and made his last words, "I invite everyone to Islam. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to forgive. Take care. Tell my children I love them." He was declared dead at 11:47 p.m. Brandon Bernard, State, Texas. In the late 1990s, Brandon Bernard, along with Christopher Villalva and 3 other accomplices, participated in the robbery, kidnapping, and killing of Todd and Stacy Bagley, a pastor couple. On June 21, 1999, the group approached the Bagleys at a gas station in Texas, forced them into the trunk of their car, and held them captive for hours while using their credit cards to withdraw money. Eventually, Villalva shot Todd in the head, killing him instantly, and Bernard set the car on fire. Stacy died, though there is debate whether it was from the gunshot or from smoke inhalation. Bernard was arrested shortly after and, in 2000, was sentenced to death for his involvement in the crime. The case became controversial due to Bernard's age at the time of the crime, 18 years old, and his secondary role in the murders. 5 of the 9 jurors who convicted him later advocated for the commutation of his sentence to life in prison, arguing they hadn't been given complete information about his lower level in the gang and his good behavior in prison. Despite appeals and clemency petitions, Bernard was executed by lethal injection on December 10, 2020, at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. His last words were an apology to the victims' families. "The words I say now cannot express what I feel, but I hope they give you some peace." He was declared dead at 9:27 p.m. Alfred Bourgeois, State, Louisiana. Alfred Bourgeois, a former truck driver, was executed by the federal government of the United States on December 11, 2020, for the murder of his 2-year-old daughter, Jacqueline Harrison, known as Jaja, in June 2002. Bourgeois, who had gained temporary custody of Jacqueline just weeks before, subjected her to physical and sexual abuse during that time. On June 27, 2002, while making a delivery at the naval base in Corpus Christi, Texas, Bourgeois brutally beat Jacqueline inside his truck, causing fatal brain injuries. Signs of sexual abuse were also discovered. Jacqueline died the following day in the hospital. Bourgeois was arrested and tried in a federal court because the crime occurred on a military base. In March 2004, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Over the following years, Bourgeois appealed his sentence, claiming intellectual disability, but all of his appeals were rejected. He remained on death row for more than 16 years before being executed. On December 11, 2020, Bourgeois was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. In his last words, he maintained his innocence and did not apologize for the crime. He was declared dead at 8:21 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. His execution sparked controversy, with criticisms about the application of the death penalty to individuals with intellectual disabilities and the increase in federal executions during the final days of President Donald Trump's administration. Jacqueline Harrison was remembered as an innocent victim, and her family described the execution as an act of justice, although they lamented that it took 18 years. Bourgeois was the 10th person executed by the federal government in 2020, setting a record for more than a century. Lisa Montgomery, State, Kansas. Lisa Montgomery, born on February 27, 1968 in Melbourne, Kansas, was executed by the federal government of the United States on January 13, 2021. Montgomery was convicted for the kidnapping and murder of Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old pregnant woman, on December 30, 2004. Montgomery strangled Stinnett and performed a cesarean section on her in an attempt to pass off the newborn as her own. The crime, which shocked the nation, took place in Skidmore, Missouri, and the baby, Victoria Jo Stinnett, survived and was returned to her family. Montgomery had a childhood marked by physical, emotional, and sexual abuse by her stepfather and other men, with the knowledge and complicity of her mother. These traumas led to the development of severe mental health issues, including borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and permanent brain damage. Throughout her adulthood, Montgomery faked multiple pregnancies, a condition some experts attributed to pseudocyesis, false pregnancy. In her 2007 federal trial, Montgomery was found guilty of kidnapping resulting in death and sentenced to death. Despite her defense team's arguments about her deteriorated mental health and the abuse she endured, the jury recommended the death penalty. Montgomery spent more than a decade on death row, becoming the only woman in the federal execution pavilion. Her execution, initially scheduled for December 2020, was postponed due to her attorneys contracting COVID-19. She was eventually executed by lethal injection on January 13, 2021, at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. Montgomery did not speak any last words and was declared dead at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. She became the first woman executed by the federal government in 67 years, and the fourth in U.S. history. Montgomery's case sparked controversy due to her history of abuse and mental health issues, leading to criticism over the application of the death penalty in her case. Victoria Jo Stinnett, the baby who survived the attack, was raised by her father and family in Missouri, maintaining a private life away from public scrutiny. Dustin Higgs. State, Maryland. Dustin John Higgs, born on March 10, 1972 in Poughkeepsie, New York, was executed by the federal government of the United States on January 16, 2021, for his involvement in the murders of 3 women in Maryland in 1996. Higgs was convicted despite not being the one who personally shot the victims, as he was considered the mastermind behind the crimes. The murders took place at the Patuxent Research Refuge, a federal property, which allowed the case to be tried federally. On January 27, 1996, Higgs, along with Willis Haynes and Victor Gloria, picked up Tamika Black, Tangi Jackson, and Mi-Shan Chin in Washington, D.C., and took them to his apartment in Laurel, Maryland. After a dispute, the women left, and Higgs, Haynes, and Gloria followed them in a van. Higgs drove to a remote area of the Patuxent Refuge, where Haynes shot and killed all 3 women. Higgs was accused of ordering the murders, although he always maintained his innocence, claiming he was a witness and not directly involved in the crimes. In 2000, Higgs was convicted of kidnapping resulting in death and other charges, and he was sentenced to death by a federal jury. Willis Haynes, the shooter, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Victor Gloria, who testified against Higgs and Haynes, received a 7-year sentence for his role as an accomplice. Higgs' execution sparked controversy because he was not the direct perpetrator of the murders and because the case was tried at the federal level rather than the state level. Maryland, the state where the crimes occurred, had abolished the death penalty in 2013, leading to criticism about the fairness of his sentence. Additionally, Higgs contracted COVID-19 weeks before his execution, and his defense argued that the virus could cause him additional suffering during the lethal injection. On January 16, 2021, Higgs was executed by lethal injection at the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana. In his last words, he stated, "I would like to say I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders." Higgs was the 13th and final prisoner executed by the federal government during the presidency of Donald Trump, marking the end of a series of federal executions that resumed in 2020 after a 17-year moratorium.